Hi everyone, it's Katie, and today I am here to review the Anna.K Tarot. This is the Llewellyn edition of this deck. Initially, Anna did self-publish the deck, and I think you can still purchase some of her self-published editions via her website, which I will link below. I decided to go with this one just because I could get it on Book Depository, which has free shipping. It just made it a lot more affordable for me. I will say right off the top of the bat that this perhaps isn't the most pretty, flowy, gorgeous deck that you've ever seen. I think it's beautiful and I love the artwork, but it's not the sort of artwork that people rave about for the artwork. Where this deck really shines, I think, is in the characters. The people that are depicted in this deck are so lifelike, so real. And I don't mean that in the artistic style, you know, it's still a very cartoonish sort of deck, but the faces and the people are so expressive that this deck is so effortless to read. It's so easy. It's also very easy to read because in large part it is based off the Rider-Waite, so there is that kind of traditional imagery there. However, it doesn't have any of the esoteric kind of symbolism that we see in a lot of other decks. This deck really portrays the messages through emotion, through that intuitive kind of sense, rather than picking up on different images that mean certain things. Therefore, I think it's a really great deck for beginners. This deck is one that I pulled out of the box and started reading with straight away, and I had really profound, deep, powerful readings right from the get-go. I have since read the book, which I don't usually do, read the whole book the whole way through, but I really enjoyed her writing style, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The box that my deck came in is the typical Llewellyn, sort of very flimsy cardboard box. It opens up from the side, and the deck was stored here and the book was here. The book that it comes with is an adorable little guidebook, although it is really quite chunky. There's a good 230 pages in here, and I think it's a really great guidebook. Her writing style is very easy to read and understand. She's quite conversational, so she'll talk to you about how she likes to do things, but she covers everything really that you'd need at least to get started with reading the tarot. She talks briefly about her own personal journey with creating this deck, which took her about 10 years from start to finish, and then she talks a little bit about what, at least from her perspective, tarot can do and what it can't do. And she does have quite a psychological sort of approach. She kind of takes a stance that tarot is best used for helping us understand our situation and what we can do. She has quite a thorough explanation of how a tarot deck is structured, and goes through you know, the 4 suits and the court cards and the mages. She also gives you a rundown of how to read with the cards in terms of shuffling and drawing, and what sort of things you can focus on to try and interpret the cards. She does talk about reversals and just says that reversals aren't really for her. However, with all of the meanings, she does include like a shadow aspect. So you could read that either as the reverse meaning, or if you don't read reversals like I don't, still considering the shadow meaning depending on, you know, the cards around it and the position of the spread. She also has some tips for practice, and this doesn't just include, you know, learning the meanings or practicing readings. She talks about, you know, inventing different stories for the minor arcana, and if you shift around the cards, how does that change the story? She suggests creating families through the court cards and kind of considering how those different members of a family play together. So I think that's really cool, and it's a different sort of perspective, especially that from any kind of guidebook that I've seen. And before she jumps into the actual meanings, she makes very clear that the meanings that she provides are jumping off points, and she stresses that the cards themselves are so nuanced and there's so much that goes into a reading. And that really you have to trust your intuition. The really cool thing about this book is that each and every card has about a page of writing, but also has a black and white full page image of the card. What I really like about this book is that she includes a little tip for quite a few of the cards. Now, this usually comes up when there are several cards that could be confused or mean similar things. So she kind of just adds an extra little explanation about how those cards differ and what you can consider when those cards come up and why they would be different. For example, the High Priestess she compares to the High Priest and explains how and why those two cards are different. Another example would be for the Sun, the tip says, the Nine of Cups stands for joy as well, but its joy is usually shorter lived and does not go as deep as the joy of the Sun. It is usually based on very specific events and on certain external circumstances, whereas the joy of the Sun, in its ideal case, is based upon joy in life itself. I think that's really, really useful, especially as a beginner. You can often see, like, how is the Ten of Swords different from death? You know, if it's both an ending, what differences are there? I think that's a really, really helpful little addition. In the back of the book, she also has 4 or 5 spreads listed, and her explanation on how to go about reading these spreads is really quite comprehensive as well. So overall, this is a really, really great little guidebook, and I don't very often read a guidebook cover to cover. I like to reference them, especially when I'm getting to know a deck, but I actually really enjoyed it. Her writing style is very simple and easy and conversational, as I've stated. This book was one that I quite happily read from cover to cover and felt like I did get quite a bit out of it. The backing of this deck is quite pretty, and it is entirely reversible, so if you choose to read reversals, you can do that quite easily with this deck. The cards are quite a bit wider and just very slightly shorter than a regular tarot card size. So it's a little bit more square, kind of like the Osho Zen Tarot. This is a Pamela Coleman Smith commemorative set edition card, which is kind of more like a traditional size tarot card, and yeah, it's just slightly taller, but quite a bit wider. As far as I can tell, the cardstock is pretty traditional Llewellyn cardstock, kind of what you expect from a Llewellyn deck, but because it's square, it kind of feels just slightly more sturdy. This kind of cardstock doesn't bother me at all. It doesn't feel like I've had some decks that just feel paper thin. This feels like a thin card, so it is what you expect when you get Llewellyn. I should also note that I have actually blackened the edges of my deck. The borders around the images are black, and then the backing isn't black, but it is quite dark. So I decided to go ahead and blacken the edges because they were very, very white, and I just thought it looked really sleek and cool. Each of the cards look like this. They have a black border, which is pretty small, so it's not obtrusive at all, I don't think. And at the bottom there is the title of the card. So it's very easy to recognize all of the cards, although I'm sure you could trim this deck if that's something that appeals to you. But the border I don't feel is obtrusive at all. It's quite thin and it's black. The images themselves I think are really lovely. They're very colourful. They're kind of pencil drawings, I think, and they're very clear, but they're still detailed. So for example, this is the Magician. So he is very recognisable. You know, it's still very Rider-Waite-ish, but there's much more movement and emotion that is driving this card rather than the more esoteric occult sort of symbolism that we draw meaning from some other cards. This is the High Priestess, who again is recognisable, but it's more about the emotion of the card that helps us interpret it rather than the symbolism. The Chariot is a little bit different from the traditional card, and it shows a chariot riding off into the sun. The Hermit, the colours are quite beautiful. She's done really well with using colour. The colours that she's chosen and the way she's used them is very evocative. Not only do you get the emotion and the meaning of the card through, you know, the characters' faces and their body posture or their body language, I think the colour is a really big facet of that in this deck as well. She's done really well with that. Death is a little bit different, but it certainly kind of encourages that more acceptance side of the death card that we like to include in a lot of the messages that we get. I really like this Strength card. I like that she's kind of like level with the Lioness, and even the colours are quite similar to the Rider-Waite in a lot of these cards. Like, you know, we get the yellow, very yellow background. So it's so similar in a lot of ways and so different in others. Like, this is Temperance, who, you know, there's a lot of similarities there with her at the edge of the water, but it's just done in a slightly different way. The Devil is recognizable in terms of, you know, this big figure in the center of the card, but rather than showing the oppression through two people having chains around their necks, it's the temptation and the that side of the devil that is actually quite clearly depicted in this card. Each of the celestial cards, the star, moon, sun and world, are all very simple. They don't have a human figure in any of them. And I really like that. I think they're beautiful, and they really, I feel like they get to the essence of the card, which is interesting because so many of her other cards are about the character expressing the meaning and the feeling of the card, whereas here she's kind of really let the celestial body do it itself, through, you know, also through color, but the, you know, the moon in this is really the center of the image, and I think it's gorgeous. Love the sun card. I think she's done really well in keeping it really simple, but it's still so clear. And the world is the world tree, with the stars, the moon, and the sun all depicted within it as well. So I've kind of been talking about how I feel like this deck is very expressive, especially through the characters. So I wanted to show you some cards that really kind of highlight that for me. This is the Nine of Wands, and you know, he looks stubborn and grumpy as hell, and it's just, you look at his face and you get half the meaning immediately. I think it's really well done. The Fool is full of so much joy and optimism and so youthful. The Hanged Man, I really like the Hanged Man as well. He's very expressive in terms of his face. The Five of Cups, here we can't see the face, but the body language is very emotive, as well as the colours, and the rain of course too. One of my favourite cards in this deck is the Ten of Swords. Usually we have the person laying on the ground with 10 swords in their back dead, whereas here this person has quite clearly had the swords in their back, but they've had to rip them out and then walk away. I think that's hugely powerful, and that, I think that's a really clever slight deviation from the imagery, but it adds a whole lot, a whole new layer to the meaning. Three of Swords, we usually see the three swords in the heart. This one we still get that sense of a broken heart, a lot of sorrow and pain, but it's instead depicted through the characters. Eight of Swords is another one I love. You know, we often talk about the Eight of Swords being all in your head, and here it is made abundantly clear that that is really, really the case. You know, she is trapped as she sees herself and in no other way. The Lovers is also a little different. It's an older couple enjoying each other in their company. And in the book she talks about how the Lovers is often, can be a romantic card, but it's that choice we make to commit to something and dedicate ourselves to something over and over again over the long term. I think that's a really beautiful depiction. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about a card that I've heard a lot of people see and it puts them off purchasing this deck, and that is the Empress. And I have to admit that when I saw this card before purchasing, I thought, oh, that's not very pretty, because often the Empress is a gorgeous card. I mean, immediately the Fountain Tarot Empress comes to mind. That's one of the most beautiful cards in the deck. But I love that a lot of these people aren't beautiful, thin, gorgeous people. So I kind of love that the Empress isn't this gorgeous young woman, because to me the Empress is the mother figure. And when we have, you know, a character that looks like she's hardly reaching her 20s, sometimes that can be a little bit hard to really sit well with for me. Whereas she looks like someone who's very abundant and comfortable in terms of her physical world and just enjoying everything that life has to offer in terms of the physical realm. There's not really any cultural variety, which I do like to see in decks where possible, but I do appreciate the variety that there is in this deck. The aces in this deck are very different. They all have young girls depicted doing something, kind of exploring and trying out things, which is really a much more readable if you're not really familiar with the traditional meanings. You know, I think this deck, she's really made an effort to make it readable through emotion, as I've said, and I think she achieves that with the aces, which are often a card that can be a little bit challenging for a very new person reading tarot because they're not really illustrative at all. Another thing I love about this deck are the court cards. The court cards are something that I sometimes struggle with, especially the Pages and the King, and I know that court cards are quite infamous for being challenging, especially for beginners. As with the rest of the deck, they are very expressive, and the emotion really comes through in these cards. The pages are all depicted by young men, and they're like, I mean, this one's really obvious. He's training with a wooden sword. They're just, these are probably the easiest court cards to read that I think I've ever seen. They're really, really effective at conveying the message through the characters. And I do kind of feel like this deck is almost like, its approach is like a story. It's almost like a children's book. You know, the artwork is quite simple and clear. I mean, look at this guy with his roses. He's quite the romantic. The images are all simple and clear, but they get their message across with such ease and such clarity. Look at this queen. I love the queens. Just with the colour and the expressions, and she's done so well at conveying the meanings of these court cards. And I think this is going to be a really great deck for me in terms of getting to know the personalities of especially the kings and the pages. As I've mentioned, I struggle with the most. They really feel like characters. They feel like individuals that you can talk to and get to know. And that's something that I don't really feel like with a lot of decks. They feel like someone I'm supposed to recognize rather than someone I can get to know. This deck, I feel like it's an open invitation to get to know the courts. So in case you hadn't noticed, I'm in love with this deck. It is just wonderful. It is certainly artwork that I'm drawn to in terms of tarot. I'm sure if you've seen any of my other videos, you know, my favorite tarot deck is the Gill Tarot, and I tend to like, you know, the pencil drawing, cartoony sort of images. It just works for me in terms of reading. And this, I think, I really like the artwork, but I think she's just done so well at conveying the meaning through the emotive, expressive way that she's drawn the figures. This deck has been really clear, but really profound for me. It does not shy away from pulling punches when it needs to, and really getting to the heart of the matter. And it's really clear and easy to read. I don't feel confused or lost in the cards. I don't second guess myself reading these cards. I know what they're telling me, even if it's something that I don't want to hear. They've been incredible to read with, and I've had some really deep, profound insights, and I've had the sharp shooting, clear answers that I've needed as well. Working with this deck is just a joy, and I couldn't recommend it highly enough. I really think it would be a fabulous first deck for a beginner, but as I've mentioned, I don't really consider myself a beginner anymore. I know I'm not advanced, but I'm getting a lot out of this deck, especially with the court cards. I'm learning a lot about how to relate and understand the court cards, which is something that I've struggled with up until this point. So this is a new go-to deck for me. I'm loving this deck. I can't really think of anything that I don't like about this deck. Would I like the cardstock to be a little bit better? Maybe, but from what I understand, her self-published version, the cardstock, is quite a bit better. And I chose to get this edition, and I'm completely happy with it. The guidebook is fantastic. The cards and the images are so expressive and readable, and I think quite beautiful too. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and please ask me any questions in the comments below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And until next time, guys, so much love. Bye.